thank you all very much for being willing to geek out with me this morning. As was mentioned, my name's Josina Vink. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm going to be diving into protecting plurality. And just to set the scene, I will share with you an example, take you back to about 13 or 14 years ago. I am studying design at OCAD University in Toronto while working at a consulting company where we've been commissioned by the North Shore Tribal Council, which is a collection of 7 Indigenous communities in what is commonly called Northern Ontario. And we were asked to inform a housing study for how elders' services for housing could look on these 7 reserves. And so, eager, having just learned all of these design methods and tools, I went to each of the communities and interviewed elders on the reserve and learned about their options. And to set the context for those of you who are less familiar with the Canadian context, if I take you back to even as late as 1996, there were residential schools where Indigenous people were being forced off reserve and into residential schools to learn and be forcibly learn European culture and the English language. So this is not so far much later. This is 15 years later. And I am interviewing these elders about their options. Many of them had been forced into residential schools and really did not want to be going to institutions off reserve for their care later in life. So we're putting together this strategy, and we're going back to each of the communities to facilitate a dialogue about the options. What had I done? Just like I learned in school, I themed all of the different insights that I'd heard, and I knew a little bit about kind of culturally appropriate design at the time, so I thought about, yes, we should try and be in a circle setting, because there was a lot of circle kind of frames that were happening in community dialogues within these First Nation communities. But what we proceeded to do, I facilitated a session where I invited the different elders who were there to provide input into what were the kind of right housing service options for them. And every time that they gave an example, I dotted which theme that we had predefined based on our discussions with them it fit. A technique in relation to a dotmocracy that I'd learned in school. So what do we think here? Is this a kind of problematic approach or a way of approaching kind of service design in this community? Well, in fact, what I was doing was kind of imposing certain logics over others while doing this work, even maybe while trying to be mindful of another culture. And in fact, I was reinforcing a kind of colonial approach to doing service design. So in this community that is grounded in a collective decision-making process, I was very much reinforcing kind of individual choices through my methods and tools. And actually, often in design, in service design, we're inappropriately perpetuating the dominance of certain logics over others. And I would actually argue, along with a number of others, that service design education and the profession of service design tends to reinforce this kind of hegemonic ways of knowing and doing, or certain dominant ways of knowing and doing over others in how we teach and how we reinforce our narratives within the service design discipline. And this worries me. And I think the reason that we should be worried as a community is that actually design's tendency to reproduce these dominant logics is actually eroding the very plurality that we need to be creative, to do counter-normative change work. We need a kind of multiplicity of ways of living and of thinking to have creative conflict and to bring forward alternative changes. So I think this is very worrying for our discipline as a whole. But to give you a little bit of context before jumping in, what is a logic? So for me, a logic is a sort of underlying rationale, a kind of explanation that guides our different ways of organizing. Pretty important for service design. They provide us with kind of how we make meaning, and they condition our thoughts and actions. So I'll give you an example. So I see logics as these kind of collections or sets of different social structures, and I'm often using this sort of typical iceberg metaphor for thinking about social structures, where you have more visible or physical things above the surface of the water that you can see, and then these more invisible regulations, norms, beliefs below the surface of the water. So these sets of social structures are logics, and to give you an example, we might have an enactment of a wedding ring. Some of you might be wearing one. Might recognize the act of saying vows. You probably know that there's marriage laws about who can and can't be married in different countries. We often have a nuclear family priority. So some of you who have a child, you might take off work when your child is ill, but you're probably not taking off work to help care for me if I'm ill. We tend to prioritize family. And some of us have baked in this kind of belief, this unconditional belief that family is forever. So this makes up a kind of logic of family, these different structures that hold together. And actually, different spheres of society have very different logics or rationales or ways of organizing. And we, as individuals and organization, we move through these different spheres often seamlessly. So when we're at home, we act with a certain kind of rationale that's different from when we're at work. There has been research done into what are the most common logics in Western societies. And so you can see here that we have kind of the market logic, which is typically kind of transaction-based and often driven by profit. We have the more state-based logic that's more about democracy and bureaucracy. We have a community logic that's more about reciprocal interactions and emotional connection. We have the profession that's really based on expertise and education. We have a family about this kind of unconditional loyalty and non-negotiable membership. And we have faith that's about, or religion that's about faith and kind of this greater purpose. So when we think about these logics, it can help us think about how sets of practices hang together, how we coexist with very different ways of thinking and being, and what's appropriate in a particular situation. And what are the ethics of advancing certain logics over others? These are the questions that I'm interested in engaging with in my work. And my hope for a takeaway for you from this morning and from this talk is that you get a sense that it actually matters what logics we use to design services with. That actually we're not just designing service offerings, but we're making space, making possible or impossible different ways of life when we're designing. So the question guiding some of my work for the last 4 years has been, how can we become deliberate about what logics we advance when to protect pluralities in service systems? And now I'm going to dive into 7 attempts. I call them attempts not to say they're not fully arrived. They included some mistakes. They're experiments, and they're experiments that I've done with colleagues and students at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design, as well as beyond some of our collaborators. The first example that I want to provide for you is an example of unpacking existing logics. This is where we started. Can we surface the different rationales that are underpinning our service systems through these entangled practices? Can we get at what's the underlying rationale here? So we started working within the Norwegian healthcare system. We did interviews where we mapped people's perspectives of the healthcare system. And we built this into a kind of larger gigamap, where you see here the healthcare archipelago, where we have these kind of different logics in relation to healthcare. You see kind of Fix-It Island, which is the acute hospital that's very grounded in like quantity of life and extending the length of life. We have Make-Do Island, which is more the logic of our municipalities in Norway that are kind of scrapping with whatever resources they have. But this big picture can leave us very kind of lost and confused. So we also zoomed into a number of service situations and started to see what's happening in these dialogues. So this particular situation is a care planning meeting. And we started to understand what is the rationale that's being provided for what kind of a care plan gets in place. Is it the specialist that's on the phone and their education and expertise that is kind of trumping the family member and their needs to support someone at home? How is that working? So then we contextualize these 6 kind of grand logics that I mentioned earlier into logics of care that were happening in the Norwegian healthcare system. So the market logic becomes a logic of choice. This might look like buying something for a bubble bath to take care of oneself. The logic of the profession comes care as expertise, which is really kind of maybe asking the doctor for advice. Or care as control. In Norway, we have strict control on the sales of alcohol and taxation around that, and that's to control for population health. We have care as social connection, the community logic. In Norway, it meant some people getting groceries for their neighbors during COVID. We have the kind of family logic, care as unconditional involvement, where we're kind of taking care of people, as I mentioned, when they're ill, for example, or giving a hug when needed. And we have care as way of life, this kind of practice of greater purpose. So with this, we gathered folks from throughout the Norwegian healthcare system, and we asked them to plot on this kind of makeshift map what were the logics that were informing their organizations most. And almost everyone said that the state, the market, and the profession were informing their healthcare organizations, those sorts of logics. But when we asked them personally what logics were informing them and their work and their kind of meaning, they said much higher were family and community. So actually, we have a kind of disjointed healthcare system where the logics of the state and the market and the profession are very dominant, and we have less space for the others. And collectively, we tried to analyze what were these kind of dynamics of what's dominant in our healthcare system and what is being pushed to the periphery through our organizations, through our public systems. So this was an interesting inquiry. We unpacked the existing logics, and it really helped us build this kind of stronger systemic understanding of what was underpinning these power dynamics. But I have to say that it left us and others a little bit unsure of what the appropriate action was. So great, now we understand what's dominant and what's pushed to the periphery, but what do we do? The next thing then that we tried was, what if we try and protect peripheral logics? What if we design these logics that are being marginalized back into our service systems? So to set the context for this, we were working in a transition that's happening within the Norwegian context right now of services being shifted from this legacy system that's centralized in hospitals and clinics, more to be decentralized in homes and communities. And what this often looks like are these kind of remote care iPads where patients are putting in the monitoring their symptoms, and then they're getting kind of red light, green light, yellow light back of what they might need to be concerned with or what they should do. It also looks like home hospitals where people are inpatients in our hospitals but are actually being cared for at home. So nurses and doctors are coming in to them for care. So one of the questions we were asking ourselves in this context was, is this inherently good that we're bringing healthcare into home and community? Or actually, are we bringing the logics of the profession, of the bureaucracy, of the market, and are we ending up hospitalizing the home when we're decentralizing healthcare into community? It's trying to have a bit of critical analysis. So we worked together to try and put forward these alternative logics and try and ground them more into these existing services. So bringing forward features in the remote care for peer-to-peer sharing, where patients or residents could share tips and tricks or strategies for dealing with their condition. We work to try and help the healthcare providers attend to the experience of the family and family caregivers in these services. We were building out programs around creating cultural humility. So how do nurses and doctors and other healthcare providers who are entering into homes that operate with very diverse cultural frameworks, how do they adapt with humility into those spaces? We're also working with the lens of hospitality. So what if, instead of just imposing the medical model with a set appointment time and kind of imposing that on the home, what if we use the framework of a visit from a friend to understand the rituals and traditions that happen in a home, and use that as a lens to then analyze how a home care visit happens and what might need to happen when someone asks a nurse if they want to have coffee or tea? Is it okay to say no and say you're on a tight timeline and continue on? So this work helped us kind of protect these peripheral logics and repair some of this erosion of them being pushed to the margins. But it actually didn't challenge the dominance of these certain logics over others. It maybe brought them in, but it didn't kind of challenge their dominance. So another attempt. Then we were trying to work to expose the dominant logics. Could we use tangible prompts to actually bring forward critical reflection on what was the superseding logics? So we did this working in mental health with 4 different hospital units in Oslo. And we started to try and understand the logics at play by looking at the history, not just the present day. And what we saw was actually the mental health system is very much grounded in principles coming from the criminal system. We have a lot of things in place still from these kind of past era and issues of mental illness being considered immoral and things like that. So we situated ourselves by doing interviews, observing these 4 different hospital units, and as well as doing museum visits to understand some of where this history has come from. And after that kind of ethnographic work and historical research, we decided to develop games. Because what we saw happening in these different wards was that healthcare providers seemed to be playing games all day. They were trying to move things around to try and make things work. So we proposed to invite them to a discursive dinner where they would play games that were based on each of their hospital units. There was a marble game that was based on real situations from their ward, where they had to make do with certain resources to try and get the patients who were represented as marbles. You can see that there's also problems with this. Representatives marbles getting into where they needed to be. There were board games and ping pong that were showing how people were moving between things, and a labyrinth that was actually based on the exact process of referral for people with addictions in Oslo, and embodying what that looked like and the trade-offs between helping some get into the green space and what happens when others are falling into the red space. So we were a bit nervous about making these quite serious services into games and how the service providers and leaders and patients and things would react. But actually, folks felt like they were playing games all day. They acknowledged and said, you know, this is not really a surprise. It really feels like this. But actually kind of playing their work as a game, it made them feel pretty hopeless and pretty stuck. So they said, great, yeah, we're playing the game all day, but we're not making the game. We're not making the rules. The government is making the rules. So exposing these dominant logics helped to help those kind of inside the system understand some of their rationale behind their actions, but also left them feeling pretty stuck. So next up, we tried to work at crafting logic hybridity. So here we were trying to explicitly work to, what if we combine multiple logics when we're developing new services? And this work was done in collaboration with a team in Tallinn, and Ava, a PhD student that I work with there. And they were working to co-design a new youth mental health service. And to do this, they started exploring what are the kind of current logics that are shaping the youth mental health service today, and what are the logics that they want services to move more into. And through that, and through a collective kind of co-design process, they were able to kind of come to a common understanding of that direction. And then when they designed their new service, they looked at the different components, like, for example, how referrals were being done or how staffing was made, and said, what is the logic of this design decision that we're choosing? So in the case for regulation, they needed to have a professional guide this kind of group visit, but for regulation, so they needed to still attend to that. But they also knew that from some of the prototyping, that having specific kinds of professionals dominated the discussions. So actually what they opted for was to have a physiotherapist be the facilitator for these mental health group appointments. So they could make some creative suggestions on their design decisions when they started to understand the rationale. And actually, this is a photo here of them receiving an innovation award from the City of Talent. So of course, when you start to be explicit about these things and start to deviate from some of the norms, you can actually develop quite meaningful and innovative services that diverge from most of what's out there. But it also doesn't encompass all of plurality. So when you talk with them, they'll also tell you that by looking at mostly just the logics of Western society, they actually ignored other logics, like from Eastern cultures, and there's a huge population of the Russian community in Estonia, and because they did this all in Estonian and representing these Western logics, it didn't actually encompass many of the aspects of culture and community and reflect the needs of that community. So it doesn't mean that attending to this then is a kind of one-size-fits-all inclusion. The fifth attempt is around speculating shifts in logics. So again, connected with mental health, we were exploring how can we see kind of the future development of these logics and how they might shift and change, and use that to inform our kind of present day. So what we did was we invited folks again to a workshop to explore the future of mental health services. When they came in, they were immediately told, welcome, so good that you came for this protest. And they were given kind of protest banners. And very soon after, things started erupting and chanting, and they were asked to follow along. And it very quickly became evident that there was massive protests throughout Norway around the unacceptability of the mental health system and huge transition underway. And what happened then as a result of these protests were big changes in the mental health system, and they were invited to 2050 to explore these different situations that had emerged. And then an empty hospital ward, we took over, and they were able to see different directions that this could go in. And in one example, it was where instead of going to the hospital, you were getting a kind of community logic that was superseding the medical logics and receiving care in libraries in a community-based way. And here's kind of a typical hospital appointment, more done as art therapy in a library. We also had the kind of professional expertise start taking over the community world, where people were invited into a scenario where doctors and nurses were monitoring everyone in their homes, and we had telling community nurses who to go out and check on and what to do through these kind of monitoring devices. What would this world look like? We also had where the market-based logic was strong, and people could buy medical technologies like we do in pharmacies for mental health, which is built on things that are already happening in the Oslo hospital today, and looking at what are the different inputs that people need to make decisions about which medical technologies could support them. And this helped to ask questions of, should this kind of market-based logic be given more space in our healthcare system? And together then, after kind of being immersed in these future scenarios, they were asked about, for their different hospital units, what logics they see as relevant, and do they need to protect against the kind of encroaching of some of these logics that were happening. And what we saw was that it did help people see some of the consequences that they weren't seeing of it coming in small ways already by having these kind of broader scenarios. But people really struggled to kind of connect it back with the present day and see how this was kind of relevant to them. So more work needed to be done around that. The sixth attempt was actually taking a hard look at design's logics itself. So can we open up the tools and concepts of design for critical examination and reimagination? This is an example of a customer journey that I did early on in my service design career. And you can see, even in this kind of typical customer journey tool, we have certain logics coming in. So we have the idea of a kind of individual customer. That's how we think about these journeys. And we have kind of these service providers and professionals that kind of are behind the line of invisibility and things like this. So we have these kind of market and professional-based logics that are informing our work. So to support this, some of you maybe have read or know of John Law's paper that's called Making Mess with Method. I really encourage you to take a look at it. It's an interesting, critical look at how methods actually tend to erase mess. They tend to make things clean. They make realities more structured, and we're actually kind of performing these cleaner realities into practice through our methods. So to kind of roll with this metaphor, we looked at how methods are hygiene and used the metaphor of the soap. And we decided to make different design methods into soaps. So here you can see an actor map. You are probably pretty familiar with it. I've done a few myself. And this is the interpretation of an actor map. You have on the bottom all of this messy burrs and chunks of things and relations and things that are happening. And then on the front, what we show people are these beautiful flowers with just these nice little lines. And then you can see that kind of, that's what we show. But of course, all of this mess is actually behind those relations that we're covering up through these kind of neat little maps. Or you can see the interpretation of an interview where an eggshell is used to show the extractivist nature of it, where we're often kind of taking information and very rarely giving the kind of benefits back to folks. So we used these soaps then to take them to design educators and ask them to reflect on how they were educating people, designers around methods, and whether they were thinking about the hygienic nature of these methods. And I would just give a shout out to a PhD student that I've worked with, Ziping Duan, who's done some brilliant work in China around localizing design. So instead of using these kind of traditional logics of design, what does it mean to go into a situated space and start to understand through the relational practices of that space what design could be, as opposed to bringing in these kind of normative ways of going about design. So challenging design logics can help us avoid the ways that design approaches inadvertently perpetuate certain logics over others. But crafting these localized approaches takes a lot of time and a lot of nuance and attunement. The very last attempt that I'll share with you is an attempt at amplifying uncommon logics. So I've told you about these kind of common logics in Western society. What if we started our design practice from counter-normative community practices and places? So here I used a long-term family tradition that is very gendered and I mostly have resisted, which is quilting, to actually materialize the different logics of care. And so, for example, we materialize things like the nuclear family or the social safety net, which is very important in Norway, or the species hierarchy where people are granted kind of permission to use other species for their own care. And then we also brought forward these more uncommon logics. What does relationship anarchy add, or mutual aid, or care webs, and kinning? What does that look like as kind of materials that we could bring forward? And folks were invited to reflect on their own kind of practices and peripheral practices and make those into quilting squares to be a part of the quilt. And then we had an exhibition with these different kind of logics of care that were uncommon. And I'll tell you that amplifying uncommon logics help to share the kind of wisdom of some of these marginalized practices. But I also want to warn you that there's a risk of kind of appropriating some of these things and bringing them from a space that that has developed these and traditions that have developed these and bringing in them to the benefit of others. So I've shared with you 7 attempts at mindfully navigating logics in service design, unpacking existing logics, protecting peripheral logics, exposing dominant logics, crafting logic hybridity, speculating shifts in logics, challenging design logics, and amplifying uncommon logics. So I hope through this you can see that there's different ways that we can actually work with this idea of it mattering what logics we use to design services with, and that we can bring forward and make space for different ways of knowing and being through our practices. And my big takeaway in this is a new word that I learned just a couple of years ago. I'm not sure if you're all familiar with it, but it's called compossibility. And it's basically just the ability or possibility to coexist. And for me, this has become a bit of a mantra. It's a question that I ask myself when I'm designing. Does what I'm designing or how I'm designing have the possibility or ability to coexist with other ways of knowing and being? Does it embrace that? And if not, can I shift so that it is more composable with these other things? So just to wrap up, this idea is based on the kind of work done around the uncommons, which is this idea that we're not trying towards sameness. We're actually recognizing that we're on very uneven ground, and we have to negotiate with each other, and we're not going to one predetermined place, that we're constantly negotiating where we're going together. And that we need to shift from all of this talk in design about designing the commons, where we're typically gathering like minds, working for the universal good, with one overarching logic of what we think is best or what the future should be, where we're trying toward nice workshops with convivial interactions and a clarity of purpose, and reducing variation through our design, to actually building out the design uncommons. And this is what I invite for you as well. Can we cultivate dialogue across borders? Can we work at doing difference together in our service systems? Can we embrace a plurality of logics? Can we lean into conflict? Can we do critical reflexivity through our design practice and not just pushing forward dominant methods with certain logics? And can we appreciate divergence in ourselves and in each other? So I invite you into the design uncommons, and I'll be around for the rest of the day and very welcome to your questions and things like that. Thank you very much.